Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk to you about my parents' story, and for me, it's a privilege to be able to do so. One of the worries that many Holocaust survivors had as they got to be pretty ancient was that their stories would be forgotten, that everything they went through would be lost to history. So I'm very happy to be able to share my folk story with you and let their memories live on in you. The way that I do it is I tell you my mother's story first, then I tell you my dad's, and then I marry them off so I can be born and we can come to the United States. And after that, I am happy to answer any questions that you might have. So I'm going to show you a couple pictures of my folks. I think it helps to see who you're hearing about. And I want to stress that, especially with my mother, everything bad that happened to her happened because she was Jewish. She wasn't famous, not a rock star, a singer, an actor, a politician. She was an ordinary, wonderful, but ordinary, everyday person, just like we are. So in this picture, and I'll pass it around if you can't see, my mother is the lady in the middle holding the baby, which is not me, even though it's very cute. And her name was Anka. When she got to the United States, it became Annette, but it was really Anka. The man is my dad, and his name was Yannick, and that became John, but it's really Yannick. So that's, I don't know who the other lady is. Now, in this picture, this is my mother again, Anka. This is her oldest sister, Ruzha, or Rose. And this is Rose's daughter, Sesha, or Celine. And I bring this picture with me because they're in the story. So I'll send this one around this way. So my mother was born quite a long time ago now. I think she would be 96 if she were alive, in Krakow, Poland. She was one of 3 girls and 4 boys, and her parents, whose names were Francesca and Joseph, were a relatively well-to-do family. They owned a chemical factory, and they had an apartment with 5 rooms, which may not sound big to us, but apparently for the time was quite large. My mother was an outdoors kind of a person, and I'm going to kind of tell you about her so you get the sense that even though it was a long time ago, people are people and don't really change all that much. She was an outdoors kind of a person, and she liked to do things like ski and mountain climb, and she was able to do that. She had a wonderful childhood. The only thing she complained about was that once in a while she would get something special, like a great pair of boots for winter, and she'd come home from school, and her mother had given them away because she'd heard about a poor family who didn't have shoes. So the family had a very strong tradition of tzedakah. She went to a Jewish high school, and she was a good student except in math. Now, I ended up being a math teacher all my working years, so that's a little weird, but nevertheless. And she said that, matter of fact, the only way she passed some of her math tests were they had to do problems on the board, and the classroom had a glass door, and her older brother would sneak out of his room and try to come up to hers and try to tell her from the door what to do. She was even known once in a very great while, I'm sure, to bunk school They were given money to take the city bus, but they would walk and save up the money, and when they had enough money, they'd go to the movies. Sure, it wasn't very often. She was a normal teenager in high school. She was pretty popular. She'd have dates and stuff, but she would occasionally mess up and make dates with two guys for the same day, and they'd both show up, and she'd be sneaking out the back door with one while her mother was at the front trying to shoo the other one out. She did something in high school that will turn out to be incredibly important down the road in her life. A new girl came to the school, and she was there on a scholarship. Came from a very poor family, and she didn't dress well, she didn't behave like the other girls, and they basically bullied her. And one day my mom came into the building and found that these mean girls had this one, whose name was Marika, inside a circle, and they were pushing her back and forth and tormenting her. And my mother put a stop to it. So one, it's a nice little story about my mom stepping up and preventing bullying. And two, watch for Marika, because she's going to play a very important part. So after high school, my mother would have loved to have gone to medical school and become a doctor. But she had two major strikes against her. One was that she was Jewish, and they were not allowed in any of the medical schools. And two, she was a woman, and ladies, they were not allowed in either. So she did the next best thing, and she became a surgical nurse. And she met and married a very nice man named Avram, and for a little while her life was very good. But then in September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, and things started to go downhill. First of all, everyone had to wear the Mogen David, the Yellow Star of David, on all their clothing. And then there were curfews where Jews had to be home by dark. And then jobs became closed to Jews. For a while, my family was doing okay because they took some money and they were able to buy false identity papers. So each of them had a paper saying they were Christian with a false name, and that enabled them to get around the city for a while. And at the same time, my grandparents converted most of their assets into diamonds, and each member of the family sewed diamonds into the lining of their clothes in case of an emergency. So they were doing okay. But then by 1942, several really horrible things happened, boom, 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 in my mother's life. And the first is that her husband was arrested and sent to Auschwitz, and he was promptly killed there. So she moved in with her sister and my cousin that are in the picture in a little apartment. My grandmother, Francesca, was concerned about the family all staying in one place. She felt that if the Nazis found them, the whole family could be wiped out in one fell swoop. So she had had people go into several different little apartments and hiding places. The second was that my grandfather, Joseph, heard that there was an orphanage right outside the city limits that didn't have water. They had had their own little water tank. It had gotten bombed. There was no water. He couldn't get gas for his car anymore, so he actually got a horse and wagon, got a couple of barrels, and was driving out to the orphanage when he was spotted by German soldiers and killed for trying to help the kids. So at this point, now my mother is very worried about her mom, and she goes to visit her. And when she leaves, there's gunfire in the street. My grandma runs outside, concerned that my mother may have been shot, and she is shot and killed right in front of my mom. And the last thing that happened, and these were all very close to each other, was my mother had a very good friend who was running another orphanage. By now, there are a lot of orphanages. And she heard that the Nazis were nearby and that they did very bad things to babies, to little kids. They would throw them up in the air, and they had bayonets or swords at the end of their rifles, and they would stick the kids, or they would throw them on the ground and see if they bounced. Really cruel, cruel things. And she didn't want that to happen. So somehow she was able to buy a box of poisoned chocolates, and she gave each little child a chocolate. And when they fell asleep and died, she took the last one for herself. Now my mother is still okay in her hiding place, but she and her sister are very concerned about my little cousin, who was 4 years old at the time. So try to think about a four-year-old brother, sister, neighbor, cousin, some little kid. And they were afraid that maybe she'd be out in the backyard or at a friend's house. They would be arrested, and what would happen to her? So they were able to find a good Christian family who agreed to take her in if the need arose. But the problem was that this family lived on the other side of Krakow, and Krakow's a fairly big city. Maybe around Providence size, maybe a little bigger, smaller than Boston, but good size. So what they did with Sesha's, they practiced each and every day taking the bus to these people's home. So they would have this little 4-year-old pick out the right money, walk to the bus stop in front, pick the right bus to get on, tell them when to get off that bus, and then lead the way to the safe house. And they did this every single day. Well, one day they were all arrested. It turned out that a friend, so-called, of my mother's turned her in to the Nazis, presumably to save his own skin. And they were all put in a wagon and were going to be taken to the train station to go to Auschwitz. Well, the driver of the wagon knew my aunt. And when he saw my little cousin, he said, no, she will not go. And he picked her up and he put her in the street and he took off. So now they're on their way to the train station, and this little 4-year-old is completely alone. And fortunately, she does exactly what she's been taught. She goes in the house, gets the money, takes the bus, goes to the safe house and says, please help me. My mother's been arrested. So now my mother and my aunt are on one of the cattle cars. You may have seen a picture. And it's, I don't remember exactly, but I'm guessing it's about 60 miles from Krakow to Auschwitz. It took 3 days for them to get there. They were crowded on this cattle car like the proverbial sardines. There was no food, there was no water, there were no bathrooms, nothing. During the trip, people who were sick, frail, elderly died, and there was no place to lay the bodies. So the dead people kind of swayed back and forth amongst the living. So they got to Auschwitz, and the first thing you see is the big arch. And I was there 5 years ago. It really is very imposing. That says, Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. And the illusion was you were there to work, not to die. The reality was mostly you were there to die. And they would make selections. So they would line up men and women, and they had lines for life and death. If you were put in the line to die, you were walked into a big room, much, much, much bigger than this one, maybe 3 times, 4 times as big. It was kind of a sickly green color, and it had big shower heads in the ceiling, and the people were told they were going to take a shower and get cleaned after the trip. But in reality, when it was all filled up, the doors would be locked, and the shower heads would release Cyclone B gas and slowly and painfully kill everyone. And then the bodies would be put in the crematoria. If you've ever gotten pizza at a place like Bertucci's, where they shovel it on the pizza into an oven on a big wooden paddle, that's what it looked like. There was a whole bunch of them in a row, little individual-sized ovens. So my mother and my aunt are put in the line to die. As they're slowly making their way towards the showers, there is a lady sitting at a table recording names and handing out stuff like the striped pajamas you may have seen in a book or a movie. And she just happens to look up as my mother's coming by, and she says, "Anka, is that you?" And it was Marika from high school. And she says, "You know what? You were the only person in high school who was kind to me, and I will not let you die." And she grabs my mother's arm. I still get chills, sorry. And my mom grabs my aunt's, and they are saved. They are saved, but life in Auschwitz is pretty terrible. And to make it worse, there was this Dr. Mengele, who was the doctor for Auschwitz, and he was a very, very evil man. And he liked to do experiments on twins, and he thought that there was a Jewish problem, the fact that we existed. That was his problem. And he thought that if he could find a way to sterilize young Jewish women so they couldn't have kids, he would eventually solve the Jewish problem, because there'd be no more Jewish children eventually. And he would make these chemical cocktails that would burn out the women's insides in hopes of finding his solution. And my mother became one of his victims. And he had about 200 or 300 young Jewish women all in one barracks that he experimented on. So the barracks, they were old army barracks. They were brick buildings, and there were like wooden frames going across with very, very thin mattresses and 3 rows high. So in a space that in one of our homes there might be a queen-size bed, 12 people slept. They were given 1 meal a day, and it was a watery bowl of soup with very little in it. Once in a great while, they got a little crust of bread. And even less often, they got a little bitty pat of butter to put on the bread. But my mother said she spent so much time outside in the harsh winters because they were marched back and forth to work. My mom worked in a munitions factory making bombs 12 hours a day. And they were also outside for roll calls a lot, that she ended up using the little pat of butter when she got it for skin cream. There were endless roll calls. I feel certain that the guards who were hired to be the guards at Auschwitz and who applied for these jobs were chosen for their qualities of brutality and cruelty. And they had power. Nobody was going to stop them from doing anything they wanted. There was no one to complain to. So they would have fun making these poor, starving people stand in line for hours sometimes, not moving. And if they moved, that was an excuse to beat them. So one time my mother moved in line, and a guard threw a 5-gallon can of paint at her, hitting her in the neck. And another time, it was a very, very cold day in winter, and a guard picked her out and made her take all her clothes off and tied her up outside and left her there for 24 hours. So that's how mean they were. So when she started telling me these stories about your age, I asked her over and over, well, what makes you survive? How do you put one foot in front of the other? There's no end in sight. She said, people who did not have hope died. They would do things like the fence around Auschwitz was not only barbed wire, but it was electrified. So you could throw yourself on the fence and die a quick death, stuff like that. And the reason that she survived, she said, was because she had hope. Because a couple things happened to her that were pretty close to being called miracles. And the first one was this. One morning, everyone in her building is made to go outside, and they're given a shovel, and they're told to dig a shallow pit. So after they dig, the guards make everybody stand with their backs to the pit, and then the guards pick up their rifles and shoot everyone. And very conveniently, everyone falls into the pit, and the guards just have to cover them up with a little bit of dirt. Well, everyone is killed by this barrage of bullets except for one person. And that one person, of course, is my mother. Not only is she not killed, she's not even wounded. She's not even grazed by a bullet. And when the guards see that, they're so surprised that they let her go. And the second miracle happened near the end of the war. Somehow she had managed to hang on to her diamonds, and she had been using them to sneak up to the fence at night and buy medicine with them. She had been a nurse, you might remember. Now, I have to admit at this point that I can't get over a feeling of anger that the people would sell stuff to these poor, starving prisoners instead of just give them whatever they could. But that's not what happened. So she was using her diamonds to buy food and medicine. She was down to her last diamond, and she saw that a group of Polish Christian women in a different part of the camp looked even worse than she did. So she snuck out to the fence, and she was able to buy some loaves of bread. And she put about half in her skirt, and she's carrying it over to these ladies. when the guards spotted her, and these guards had attack dogs. The Germans had taken even people's family pets. They took my mother's German Shepherd and trained them to be killers. So when the dogs ran up to her, she was pretty convinced that that was it, and she was about to be killed. But the dogs came up to her and stopped. And not a single dog even put a paw on her. And when the guards caught up to the dogs, they were so surprised again that they let her go. So she brought the bread over, ran back, got the rest of it, and did the same. Near the end of the war, there were forced marches. So now Germany is losing. Germany knows it's going to lose the war, and that when other countries and people see what they've done, they're going to be appalled, horrified. So they want to try to hide some of the evidence. So they start taking these poor people on forced marches, hoping they'll die out in the middle of the woods somewhere where they won't be found. I'm not quite sure the rationale. And my mother and one of her brothers are made to do this. So they march from Poland to Germany and back again. And it is on this march that my uncle dies. My mother begged him to survive. She said, look, somebody has a smuggled radio. We know the war's almost over. Hang in there. And he just doesn't. So in my family, we have this kind of sweet superstition or feeling that his job was to get her through. And once he knew she was going to make it, he could let go and pass on. So the camp is liberated on January 27th, 1945. And I am not particularly good with dates, but I remember this because it was my mother's birthday. It was her 27th birthday. It was a group of Russian soldiers. Turned out the first group that came were actually women on motorcycles. And the camp was liberated. And she and my aunt walked back to Krakow. Now, my mom was a little taller than me, something that has always bothered me. And so she was about 5'4", and she weighed about 125 pounds when she was arrested. When she was liberated about 2.5 years later, she was 85 pounds. So they walked back to Krakow. Of course, this is pre-internet, no computers, no cell phones or anything. So the Red Cross had set up stations where people could sign in, and that was how you tried to find family and friends, by checking these Red Cross stations. And she got a job working for the Russians as a censor while she was trying to get a visa to the United States. So let me tell you about my dad now. His experience was different. He also grew up in Krakow, Poland. He was one of 7 kids, 6 boys and 1 girl. And they were quite poor. They lived in the Jewish ghetto. And my grandparents, Moshe and Leah, had a little tiny grocery store. I swear when I saw it, it's smaller than this room. And big pickle barrel and stuff. And they all lived in a couple of rooms above the store. So when my dad graduated from high school, he went in the Army. Excuse me. Which was very unusual for a Jew. And it was even more unusual for a Jew to be any kind of an officer, and he was a first lieutenant. His grandfather had fought with a famous Polish general in World War I who got a medal, and that let my father be an officer. So when Hitler invaded Poland, Hitler The German army came with guns and tanks and planes and well-trained soldiers. The Poles were on horses. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize that the Poles did not do so well against the Germans. And they were forced back into Russia, where my dad and his brother, who was with him, were promptly arrested. And they were offered Russian citizenship. But my dad was afraid that if he accepted, when the war ended, they wouldn't let him out of Russia. And he desperately wanted to go back home. So he said, basically, thanks, but no thanks. Well, they didn't like that, and they decided to be more convincing. Okay, so this part's gross. Just be warned. They buried him up to his neck in poop. I told you. And yet he said no. So he and his brother were put on a train and sent all the way across Russia to Siberia. And not just to Siberia, but to a labor camp north of the Arctic Circle. So way up north, in the middle of a forest. And their job was to cut down trees. So the way that it worked was you cut down one tree, you got one piece of bread. You cut down 2 trees, you got 2 pieces of bread, and so forth. So at first, everyone is so hungry that they're chopping like crazy. But very soon, my dad realizes that people who are working too hard are breaking their backs. And then they're dying because they can't work, so there's no food. So he and his brother talk it over and decide it's better to be hungry but survive. And they start just chopping a little bit, and they sneak into the captain of the camp's garden at night ever so carefully and steal a potato once in a while, and they survive. After a while, they realize that the Russian soldiers are not really bothering to check these trees very carefully. So they move the trees from one spot to another, and they're getting by. Now an officer comes from Moscow and says he needs tailors to make uniforms for the army. At this point, my dad had probably never even sewed a button on a shirt, but my uncle was a tailor, and he said, look, it's a long train ride. Tell him you're a tailor, and I'll teach you on the way. So off they went. Then, towards the end of the war, the Russians were ready to go into Poland, and they decided they would take all these Polish prisoners and drop them out of airplanes first. Let them be the ones in the front lines to be killed first. So they take my dad, who has never even been on an airplane, and they put a parachute on him, and they push him out of this plane. And I want to tell you that up until maybe 40 years later, when we went on a family trip to Disney World and made the huge mistake of putting my dad on Thunder Mountain, that was the most afraid he had ever been. But he survives, he lands, he fights his way back to Poland, but he's shot in the back of the left leg. And now he gets his own mini miracle, because the army surgeons were so overworked with wounded that they were just chopping arms and legs off. They didn't have time to try to save them. But my dad wakes up just as that knife is coming down and recognizes the doctor, who's from his hometown of Krakow, and begs him to take the time to save his leg, and he does. So the war ends. My dad is assigned to be the military administrator of a hospital in Krakow, and it is then, actually, when he finally gets back home, that the 2 worst events of the war happened to him. And the first thing is right away he goes back to his home to see if he can find out what happened to his parents. Because when he left, they were still okay. And he gets back there, and they're gone, but he knows they didn't just move, because all his parents' things are still there. He can see them. So he knows they must have been arrested and taken away. And he never found out what happened to his folks. When we went back 5 years ago, we found out that they had most likely been taken to another concentration camp named Belzec and killed there. And the second thing is he's walking down the street in his uniform going home after work one day when a Polish man comes up to him on the street and says, "I would like to buy you a drink." And my father says, "No, that's okay." He said, No, please, I'd like to buy you a drink and thank you for your service." So they go into a bar and the man gets 2 drinks, hands my dad one, and then he holds up his glass and he says, "I would like to propose a toast. Here's to the brave soldiers who fought for us, and thank God the Jews are dead." So my dad puts down his glass and walks out, but he's heartbroken. And for the only time in his life, he starts drinking. But now he meets my mother at a party. And for my dad, it was love at first sight. For my mother, no. And she says to him, "Look, I've been to hell and back. I'm sick. I don't have time for a boyfriend. And besides, I would never date anybody who was a drinker." So that's easy. He stops right away. But he still has to convince her that he's wonderful. So he takes an entire month's salary. And with that, he buys and presents to my mom 1 orange. That's what he could get. But luckily for me, who wouldn't be here otherwise, it does the trick. And they start dating and get married. So now the big issue is getting to America. And I am very sad to tell you that it wasn't easy. The United States, a beautiful Statue of Liberty out in the harbor, give me you're tired, you're poor, yearning to be free. Not so much with these Jewish refugees. So they got as far as Paris because I had an uncle who had left Poland way before the war and gone to New York. And he got them papers and money to get to Paris, but they were stuck there. You had to prove that you were healthy. Well, not that many concentration camp survivors fit that description. You had to show an X-ray of your lungs. My mother had tuberculosis, which at the time was fatal. But she had a sister, my Aunt Helen, who had been hidden. My mother had actually carried her over the mountains and found a farm family who would hide her. And she had survived the war. She had been hidden in the barn under the cows. So I'll let you think about how pleasant that must have been, but she was safe. And she had her own miracle because one day the Nazis came to the farm looking for hidden Jews. And this farm wife was very brave. If my Aunt Helen had been found, not only would she have been killed, but so would the farmer and his wife. So she marched into the barn. She stood on the trap door right on top of my aunt and said, "Be my guest, look around." And they looked and didn't find. So it is my Aunt Helen's x-ray that my mother uses as her own. But now my dad, who's as skinny as can be, but healthy, can't seem to get a visa. So he goes to the consulate in Paris, and he kind of figures out that a bribe would do the trick. If he had some money to give him, it would work, he would get his visa. But he didn't have any money. So it was time for another grand gesture. So there was a big, old, heavy armchair in the room. My dad, who was maybe 5'5" and maybe 130 pounds, gets down on one knee like this, and I can't duplicate it, but I can tell you, grabs the leg of the chair in one hand and picks it up over his head and says, "Am I healthy?" And the man says, "Yes," and gives him the visa. So actually our papers to go to Canada came first. So we went to Canada because my mother had family there, but the winters were too harsh for my mom. So in 1952, 7 years after the war ended, we finally made it to the United States. It was actually Thanksgiving Day, which is very nice. And even though my mother was sick quite a lot as I was growing up, I would still say that they had 50 good years together, which is wonderful. And that's their story. So now if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
When you went to America, where'd you go?
Well, we went to Connecticut. Back then, the way the immigration laws worked, somebody had to have a job waiting for you. And the only place they had a friend was in Connecticut, so I grew up in Hartford.
Were you born in America?
No, I was born in Paris. I am basically a miracle myself, because after what Dr. Mengele did to my mother, she wasn't supposed to be able to have any kids. So she got pregnant in Paris, and then she miscarried, so she thought, that was it. But at about 4 months into the pregnancy, I guess I started kicking. And so what we think is that I must have been twins, and one twin miscarried, but I was in there like this saying, "You're not taking me, I'm not going." So I was born in Paris. So I came to the United States when I was 4. Anybody else have a question? Any kind of question?
All right. So, how did your father make money? What was he doing after the war to earn that orange?
He was still in the Army, and he was the military administrator of a hospital. So he had an Army salary for whatever that amount was. Yeah.
Your parents' siblings, did most of them not make it out?
Yeah. So my mother's 2 sisters survived, and only the brother who had gone to the United States. So the other 3 brothers, her parents, all her aunts, all her cousins. And on my dad's side, one brother made it to England and fought with the English army, and one brother hid in Russia, and every single other relative died. Yeah. Anybody?
What happened to the 4-year-old?
Do you know, she is alive and well. She's probably in her late 70s now, and she lives in Antwerp, Belgium. Yeah. Her husband is a diamond cutter. He takes the stones and makes beautiful jewels out of them. Yeah. Anybody else?
I have a question about the store. So you said you went back 5 years ago, that it was your grandparents' store.
Yeah.
So, was it still a store, or?
When we found the building, not easily, but we found the building, and it was being renovated by a Polish man. It had been a curtain store, I think, for a long time after my grandparents, and he was going to use it for some kind of retail purpose. He was remodeling, so it was kind of a wreck when we saw it, but yeah, it was going to be some kind of little retail establishment. And he was very nice and let us look around, and in my broken Polish, we were able to talk a little bit, and it was very nice. Anybody?
Was it hard for your parents to talk about it?
Not so much for my dad, but for my mom, extremely hard. And not only was it hard for her to talk about it was really hard for me to listen to. So I have the feeling now that I really wished I had been braver, because I probably know a very small fraction of what really happened to her. And I tried to get her hooked up with the Spielberg project to record her history, and she just couldn't do it. So yeah, it was very hard.
Do you have any siblings?
No, my mother tried to have more kids, but she would almost die every time. And finally, a very nice obstetrician said to her, "Live to enjoy the one you have."
You were her miracle.
I was, yes, I was her miracle.
Why didn't she just adopt some?
You know, she wanted to. So when she became a foster mother, and we would take in babies before they were adopted while the paperwork was being processed. And there was one who had been mistreated that we kept for over a year, and my parents tried to adopt, and they told them they were too old, so they didn't let them adopt. So they were stuck with me. Good thing I'm wonderful. Anybody else?
My great grandparents only had like one kid, so like on my mom's side,
Yep.
so it was kind of like how that was.
Yeah.
But they left in 1905.
They were lucky. They were lucky. I asked my mother, like, why, if her family had money, didn't they get out? And she said, you know, it took them too long to realize it wasn't going to be just another pogrom, as there had been over and over in history. Nobody could anticipate the scope of what bad things were going to happen, and then they were stuck and they couldn't get out. Anybody else?
How do you feel like it's affected, you know, the way she is after the war, and how it affects you? And
Well, so of course physically she was sick most of my life. She spent a lot of time in hospitals. Emotionally, you know, she had nightmares for a very long time afterwards. But she was a rock, my mother. She was a wonderful person, and she really got her priorities straight. And she taught me that it's not money, it's not possessions, it's people, it's family. As far as I'm concerned, it's pretty documented. The second generation, which is what we're called, you know, we're fairly neurotic, because we learned from early childhood that bad things could happen to people. We didn't grow up with any kind of sense of security that the world was a good place. So many of us are a little bit messed up and a little neurotic. But I hope that I also got the positive aspects of it. I devoted a lot of my life, I hope a good enough portion, to giving back, to volunteering, and so good and bad out of it.
Sort of as a follow-up question to that, how did I would imagine that there was a lot of anger about being Jewish too, or maybe there wasn't, I don't know. Like did you, like I know Connecticut, I actually grew up in Manchester, Connecticut.
Oh,
so,
did you?
Yeah, so I know like the
We
whole
lived in
community.
Manchester at one point.
We could talk later on anyway. But the point is I know that there's a very strong Jewish community there if you wanted to take advantage of it. But of course,
Yeah.
if you didn't, there was also that too. I'm very curious as to, you know, once you were settled and you felt safe.
Yeah.
Was Judaism still part of an important?
A
part?
very important part.
Okay.
You know, my parents didn't keep kosher or anything like that, but my mom lit Shabbat candles every Friday nights and made chicken soup, and we celebrated all the holidays with big family events, and my dad spoke for his local Holocaust center. I always had to go light a candle for one of the 6 million. They were not bitter about being Jewish at all, which I'm grateful for because it's an important part of who I am.
You said that one of your goals for doing this speaking is to continue the story so that people don't forget. Do you have some advice for our students for how they could participate in help making sure that we ourselves, plus the rest of the world, doesn't forget?
Well, I think, first of all, just going home and telling your families about the story. And then I think the important thing is living your life in such a way that these things don't keep happening, and they are still happening. If we look at Africa, how many genocides have there been? Stepping up when people are bullied, when people are hated for no good reason other than some kind of stereotype or prejudice. My goal is that people grow up to be mensch, you know, to stand up for what's right. And when I speak in the inner cities, the other goal is to help them appreciate that even when life is horrible, you should have hope because it can get better. But probably you guys know that, so I'll just say, be a force for good, be a force for peace. Don't hate, don't prejudge. The world will be a better place.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We really appreciate all of this, and our students certainly have more to learn, but this attitude.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.